Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Biden has deployed thousands of troops to Eastern Europe. The Russians are setting up field hospitals along the border. 175,000 Russian troops will be on the border in the next month. This is what legitimate war looks like. We are on the edge of war. And why is that? So over the last year and a half, we've talked about things like Afghanistan, we've talked about oil prices, we've talked about the economy, we've talked about West Virginia delegates running into the Capitol, the January 6th insurrection, and all kinds of things. But today I really want to talk about Ukraine and Russia and the tensions between the United States and Russia. So even as of this morning, President Biden has not committed more troops leaving Fort Bragg to go to Eastern Europe.
The Pentagon says 2,000 soldiers will be leaving from Fort Bragg in North Carolina headed to Germany and Poland, and another 1,000 troops will be moving from Germany to Romania.
And the question becomes, what's going on? What's the tension between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine? That's a great question, and we'll go over about 6 reasons why, but brings me to something else. Reminds me of some conversations we used to have in the Pentagon about the rational actor model, and are these individuals acting rationally? And we'd always have these discussions about Ahmadinejad, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, President Trump, and several others. Are they rational actors? So what does Putin really want? I mean, is Ukraine a red herring, or is there something about Ukraine that has driven Putin that direction? We don't really have to look any further than his own words. So let's look at the 3 items that President Vladimir Putin has demanded of the European Union and of the West. And let's look at some of his own words to determine, is he playing poker like CNN states, or is he actually willing to go to war for some of his demands? Putin's sphere of influence is collapsing, and he knows it. Ukraine became independent in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. In Putin's own words, in an address to the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation in April 25th of 2005, above all, we should acknowledge that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of this century. It was a disaster. The fall of the Soviet Union, in Putin's eyes, was the disaster of the century. On July 12th of 2021, Vladimir Putin wrote an article on the historic unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And he wrote, Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. There's no difference in Putin's mind between Russians and Ukrainians, and he needs to bring Ukraine back into the fold. So we have to think about this in terms of regional dominance and this type and geopolitical. But honestly, this is about what this guy right here, Vladimir Putin, wants. And we have to analyze what he wants and whether or not he is a rational actor. So let's step back just for a few minutes. I want to bring you up to speed with what has happened, because I really want to get into Putin himself. But before we do that, we've got to talk about, where are we today? So a couple months ago, Russia started sending about 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border. The argument was that they were actually doing a military exercise. So this was right before a big meeting that was supposed to occur with the European Union and so forth in Geneva. And, they were going to talk about COVID-19 and some other stuff. But then, Russia goes and places troops on the border. So now the entire meeting now shifts from other stuff to Russia. And that's when Vladimir Putin comes in and says, I've got 3 demands of the European Union. Putin demands are like, number 1, no more expansion of NATO. So NATO's this big organization, and since 1991 has kind of gobbled up a lot of the former Soviet Union countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Putin sees his sphere of influence collapsing because NATO is now pulling in all these other countries. Georgia and Ukraine are still holdouts. The second item that Putin wanted was for NATO to withdraw all of their troops in Eastern Europe. So Putin's thoughts are like, I don't want any type of military cooperation. I don't want any exercises. I don't want anything occurring in the countries that were former Soviet Union. And then the third and last is that the United States vow that we will not support or defend any Eastern Europe allies. So that was his 3 demands. So you could extrapolate with Putin going to Geneva and saying, these are my 3 demands, that if the European Union and the United States do not placate to these demands, that he's going to invade Ukraine. So that's where we're at. So in response to this, the United States has talked about doing sanctions and providing lethal aid to Ukraine, which we've done. But the thing of it is, back in 2014, when Vladimir Putin went into Crimea and President Obama applied sanctions and so forth, those didn't change his behavior. So I don't necessarily know if sanctions are going to be beneficial. Side note, sanctions actually don't work. And right now, with the way that most European nations use natural gas that comes from Russia, I don't know, maybe like Germany, they're going to say, no, don't do sanctions, not on natural gas, not on oil, because if they do, then Germans will be freezing by come end of winter. Let's just real quick talk about what's going on. Why is there tensions between the United States and Russia? So the first one is the annex of Crimea. That's still on our mindset. That was February 2014. Russian Federation annexed Crimea and supported separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. The next reason why Putin, as he brought up, is NATO's expansion and Ukraine's desired addition. So Ukraine actually has put into their constitution an action plan to become part of NATO. When the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, was asked what would be something he would ask President Biden, his answer was, why are we not in NATO? And this brings us back to Putin. Putin's also concerned about the expansion of NATO and that the United States has actually reneged on things in the past. Secretary Baker had made it clear during the Bush administration that NATO would not expand 1 inch east. But, like I said earlier, now NATO has expanded into numerous Eastern European nations. Next, another thing that's going on right now is Putin is actually herding in the polls. Well, not the Russian polls, but the Ukrainian polls. 81% of Ukrainians say they actually have a negative attitude towards Putin. This is not good for somebody who has a fairly large ego. On top of that, the president of Ukraine, remember I talked about him, Zelensky, earlier, that Ukraine has full and permanent support of his European allies for Ukraine to come into NATO. So I think at this point in time, Putin has a feeling that the West is getting too large, too great, and that he's got to step this up and take another tactic. On the geopolitical side, another thing that I find may play into Putin's calculus is specifically the perceived debacle of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. And we've talked about that before. And we'll throw a link up and you can read my opinion on Afghanistan. However, the world sees the United States as somebody who cannot necessarily be trusted to support them if in fact they're in some type of situation. And I think Putin's going to is betting on this. Also, with Chancellor Merkel leaving Germany, she was like a bulldog on Putin. Now that she's gone, Putin sees also as Germany being a little bit relaxed when it comes to its attitude towards Russia. Putin's eyes, President Biden being weak, and then you have Chancellor Merkel gone. This may be an opportunity for Putin to go in and reunify parts of the former Soviet Union. And finally, what's the pinnacle for all the tension? Well, of course, 100,000 troops being on the border has caused a lot of tension for the Biden administration. My fear is going to be a tit for tat type of situation. As the United States commits more troops, Russia commits more troops, the airspace above Ukraine becomes crowded, the seas in the Black Sea becomes crowded, and all it takes is one incident between Russian and US or Russian and an allied military. The next thing we know, we're on the brink of nuclear war. So going back to the original question, is Putin a rational actor? I believe so, yes. He has a set of goals that he's trying to achieve. He has gone through a decision-making process saying, for me to achieve these goals, these are things I have to do. Is this a dangerous situation? It's a horribly dangerous situation. Let me know what you think. Is Putin being a rational actor? Throw it down in the comments. Do you think that I'm completely crazy with what I think are the causes and the tensions that's going on? Let me know your thoughts.